Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joe Morris with the Fastener Training Institute, and I'm helping out as your moderator today and assisting with the technicalities of GoToWebinar. Certainly very excited to be part of this year's virtual joint fall conference. Before we kick off the presentation and introductions, I just want to review a few GoToWebinar features to help you navigate through the session today. First of all, due to the size of the audience, all attendees are muted. This is intended, however, to be a very interactive session, and we certainly do want your questions. So when you have a question, you can either type it into the question pane of your control panel, and I'll read them, or you can type in unmute me so that you can ask your question, or you can just raise your hand by clicking the hand icon, in your control panel. You can raise it or put it down. At that time, I'll unmute you and you can just ask your question. But please remember, we're going to hold all questions until the very end of the presentation. All right, regarding connectivity, as you all know, there's a lot of internet traffic right now. If you experience any internet issues or connection problems, and it certainly could happen, we are recording all these sessions, and the video will be shared within a few days with all of you. That's all I've got. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to the president of Pac-West and the general manager of the Western Fastener Processing Division at ND Industries, David Palmquist.
All right. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate your help this morning, and I'm glad to be with you all this morning and excited to be able to start this virtual conference. As Joe said, I am the current president of the Pac-West Fastener Association, and it's my privilege to kind of kick off this virtual event. And I just want to thank you, all of you. We've got a great turnout today, and I want to thank you for joining Pac-West, SEFA, and SFA for this joint conference, connecting at a distance. And this wouldn't happen without the support of all you that are currently here to listen to Dr. Thornberg, and also of our ongoing sponsors. So I do want to thank Star Stainless, ND Industries, Brighton Best, Birmingham Fastener, BTM Manufacturing, Eurolink Fastener, and also want to thank Joe Morris, she and Fastener Training Institute, because they've been a great supporter as we've had to move virtual on a lot of these events, and so we really appreciate that. I also want to give a shout out to the members in SFA and SEFA, and of course Pac-West, that put together a incredible conference that was supposed to be in Texas and had to be flexible and navigate to an online forum that we're doing now. And so a lot of people came together with some creativity and with some effort to make this happen. So I'm very thankful for all of you behind the scenes that are making this happen. So can't do an applause or a shout out or whatever that is, but we do thank you. And I know that all those that are tuning in appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that. So that being said, let's get to why you are here. And I have the privilege of presenting our speaker for today. So we've heard from Dr. Chris Thornberg before. I have certainly appreciated his ability to present a lot of technical information, and certainly he's got his hands cut out for him today because these are unprecedented times. And I'm really excited to see how he navigates telling the future, which is what we all want to hear and nobody knows. So let's see how he does that. He's an expert in economic forecasting, regional economics, labor markets, industry analysis. 2015, he was named the California State Treasurer's Council of Economic Advisors. Holds a PhD in business economics from the Anderson School of UCLA. So we're building you up, Chris. Hopefully you're ready for us. So let me please welcome Dr. Chris Thornberg.
I appreciate that, David, very much. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you happen to be in at this particular point in time. I love David's mixed metaphor there when he said, I have my hands cut out for me. There's probably a good lesson there. This, of course, is the second presentation of the year to give to the association. And what's interesting, of course, is where we started the first time out. Boy, it was just a few short months ago, yet it seems like forever ago that I was with you. And of course, one of the very final questions that we ended up being asked, and we discussed at quite length, was, well, what about this, well, what we called then the coronavirus thing, or the novel coronavirus, what we now know, of course, as COVID-19. And I remember kind of talking through various scenarios back then, but of course, what I said more than anything else is huge amount of uncertainty. Obviously, in the system right now, if this comes, how bad it will be. We had really no experience with it. And, you know, this kind of goes back to what I was talking about. And to put this in a little bit of context, let's go back to where we were at the start of the year. You know, it's funny, on the right-hand side there is the Wall Street Journal Next Recession Survey. And when I was with you at the start of the year, I was talking about how this same survey from February of 2019, 80% of economists had said we were going to have a recession by the end of 2020. Of course, what I've been talking about in my last two presentations was how I just didn't buy into this relatively dismal view of the economy. Indeed, I said that, remember, because no one was talking about the virus beginning of 2019, what they were talking about was the issues with real estate, the issues with the Chinese trade war, the issues with inflation and interest rates, and so on and so forth. By the beginning of this year, when I was with you in person, again, the conversation was wrapped around a lot about, well, it looks like those folks are backing off their dismal predictions. Only 11% now say there's going to be a recession this year. And of course, even then, remember that 11% we're not talking about the virus. And here we are in the midst, of course, of the COVID-19 recession. This thing was, for the most part, close to a worst case scenario. And certainly it has been dramatic. How dramatic? I won't get too much into the details. You probably, like me, are getting almost tired of hearing it on a minute-by-minute basis in the press. Over 40 million cases globally, 1 million deaths. The U.S., of course, is home to about 1/5 of all cases and deaths. Overall, we're going to experience well over 250,000 additional deaths this year. Context is helpful here. In general, there's about 3 million deaths per year in the United States, so slightly less than a 10% bump. But of course, what really is happening, what we really want to talk about is the recession. And this was a truly unique business cycle. And I mean that in more ways than, gee, I didn't call this one. No one did, right? It really came out of left field. It was a truly almost unpredictable situation, as the case may be. But when I say the word unique, I don't mean it just in the context of the fact that this thing was hard to predict, hard to see coming. It also is a completely different kind of business cycle. You know, when you think about, for example, the Great Recession or the Tech Recession, the last two major recessions in the United States, both of those were easy to see coming. That is to say, when you took a step back, maybe afterwards, when you started unpacking in the lead up, what you saw were the problems, the imbalances forming that eventually led up to the start of those particular downturns. This was not that kind of downturn. This was not a downturn that was generated as a result of years of excess something, excess consumer spending, excess building, excess investment in tech, so on and so forth. This type of recession truly started from almost nothing, and then of course turned into this really amazingly eye-popping sort of business cycle. So it was truly unique. And the reason I spend a lot of time talking about this is I will tell you that most of the predictions about where our economy are going do not take this into account. Indeed, as you know, of course, most of the predictions out there is that this thing is going to take years and years to recover from. And as I get into this, what I'm going to tell you is we don't buy that. Rather, as much as we understand that this business cycle has generated some eye-popping numbers, think of that negative 32% growth rate in the second quarter of the year. Think about the fact that unemployment hit almost 15% in 2 months. We've never seen anything like that. But putting all that to one side, putting dramatic numbers to one side, the underlying sources of this recession are so different than past recessions. The past recessions, those lessons simply do not actually apply here. And that, of course, gets into the whole idea of the U versus V debate. And that's what this is all boiled down to. As sophisticated as macroeconomic forecasting is, in the end, it all boils down to what's your favorite letter, right? Now, the U camp, again, those folks who say that this downturn is severe, it's going to remain in the system for a very long time. They have lots of different fancy symbols, square root signs, L's, W's, you name it, Nike switches as the case may be. But again, whatever, you can all lump them into the long, slow recovery camp. However, Beacon, once this whole thing began and we sat down and started analyzing things, we came up with a modestly different thought, which was a V, a relatively rapid recovery. We said, look, this is not a typical business cycle in as much as it's not generated by, of course, the excesses of the preceding expansion. This is rather like a natural disaster. And what I mean by that is twofold. A, like all natural disasters, there are, of course, tragic consequences. Whether it's a hurricane, an earthquake, or in this case, a pandemic, you have to feel for the 250,000 families that have lost loved ones to this particular disease. Our heart goes out to them. But at the same time, as tragic as it is, natural disasters do not tend to have long-run consequences. And that, of course, was, I think, the net result of the conversation we had a little earlier in the year. I said, well, it might be severe, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be something that's long, because natural disasters, again, do not have long-run type consequences. Now, again, this is very much out of the norm. You've certainly seen all these sort of major negative headlines out there. It's going to scar the U.S. labor market for the next decade. The worst downturn since the Great Depression. One of my former colleagues at UCLA have says that this has morphed into a depression type crisis. I love that, depression type crisis. I would love to take that economist, put him in a time machine, send him back to 1931 America with about 10 cents in his pocket, bring him back, and then tell us how much this is truly like a depression. It's amazing to me the rhetoric we use with almost no context. Of course, this isn't a depression type context, but putting that rhetoric aside, there's no doubt that some of the predictions out there are pretty dramatic. This is a forecast that comes from the Congressional Budget Office. Let me explain a little bit about what this is. This is not a traditional forecast. This is a measure of the output gap, the gap between what we could be producing and what we are actually producing. And the way to think about this graph is to think about the last two recessions, in particular the Great Recession. The Great Recession, of course, was a 6-quarter recession that began in the first quarter of 2008 and ended in the second quarter of 2009. Now, when you think about that particular downturn, the pain, of course, started with the actual downturn, those 6 quarters. But the real representation of the pain was how fast it took the U.S. economy to get back on an even keel, to get back up on its feet and produce up to its capacity. And in that case, it took about 7.5 years to get back to normal. That is an incredibly long run period. And that gets into the whole idea about how painful the Great Recession was, why it was so bad. It's not just the down, it's how long it takes to get back up and running again. Now, if you look at the CBO's prediction, they're predicting something very similar. A huge record downturn in 2020 itself, but still taking about 6, perhaps 6.5 years to get back to normal levels of economic activity, almost on par with the lost output that occurred during the Great Recession. If you're looking at this, you're going, wow, this is pretty grim. But this is a combination of two things. First of all, we have to remember that the general always fights the last war. And more often than not, this is exactly what's happening. I remember going back to the beginning of the Great Recession when Beacon made the call then. And all these folks, even when we acknowledge, okay, housing is collapsing, everybody said, it's not a big deal. Why? The last 2 recessions weren't all that bad, ergo this one's not going to be that bad. Well, that was a completely wrong pronouncement, as the case may be. It turned out to be the worst recession in the post-World War II period. This time around, it's almost the same idea. They're simply talking about the last recession being this recession. The last one was bad, ergo this one must be bad. It doesn't work that way. Every recession is different, and understanding the sources of that recession will go some length to explaining how long the recovery is going to take. And that's really where I think this whole thing begins. Because anybody who says this is going to be as bad as the Great Recession, well, you have to go a long way to explain why that is. Look, the Great Recession occurred not just out of the blue the way this one did. Rather, the Great Recession was driven by the excesses of the previous 6 years. Remember the subprime lending bubble? $15 trillion of bad debt poured into the US economy in the midst of one of the greatest financial frauds ever perpetuated in the history of the planet. They poured tons of money with no lending standard in the consumer sector, and that in turn created massive imbalances inside the economy. Housing was one of them. Remember, at one point in time, the US was producing well over 2 million units, housing units per year. But it wasn't just housing and the excess production of housing, the excess borrowing. It also had a lot to do with subprime auto loans and subprime credit card loans. And the fact that people felt like, hey, my house is going to go up 12% per year forever. I don't need to borrow anymore. I don't need to save anymore. Saving is a thing of the past. That's last generation's problem to deal with. Now, overall consumer spending grew to a record high level. Savings rates dropped to a record low level. The US was running a massive trade deficit. As good as the economy may have felt in 2006, the reality was it was rotten to the core. And when things started to fall apart, which by the way began in 2006, it took years to recover from. Why so painful and long? Well, think of the millions of jobs created, say, for example, in construction and consumer finance. Those jobs were never coming back because they never should have been there in the first place. Those people had to rebuild their careers, rebuild their income base. You had flow stock problems. We entered that recession with massive oversupplies of automobiles and houses that took years to burn off. You had balance sheet issues. Think of all the households that entered that with tremendous amounts of debt. And it took them years to work off that debt and get their debt to income ratios back to a normal level. And of course, you had the problems in the financial market, problems of their own creation, of course, but it took them years to get their balance sheets healed. And in the meantime, lending was constrained. It was an ugly long run circumstance. And by the way, there was a wonderful book written a few months after the Great Recession came to an end called This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly. And they go through the history of financial bubbles, the collapse of those financial bubbles, and how they always create the worst recessions. It's worth noting the Great Depression also followed the collapse of a large national financial bubble. So again, these sort of things create those kind of bad recessions. As for the pandemic, why? What? How? How does this look anything like the Great Recession? Listen, I get it. It's dramatic. The fear and the public mandates that came at the beginning of this thing as it was spreading across the United States caused a record contraction in economic activity, but it was a transitory shutdown. People didn't stop spending because they couldn't spend. They stopped spending because they were afraid to spend, or the government said they couldn't spend. It's a different kind of situation completely, and it's not the kind of situation that creates long-run damage. You don't need to have a major restructuring. You don't have a massive debt problem to dig your way out of. It doesn't have any of these long-run aspects. Now, it isn't harmless. Obviously, it isn't harmless. The tragedy of the disease itself, but also, of course, while the economy is shut down, look, businesses lose revenue, consumers lose revenue, and at some level, that spills into the supply chain and it creates disruptions in the economy. But how much disruption, how much harm? Well, right at the beginning of this thing, we said that all boils down to these 5 big questions. How healthy was the economy ahead of time? How much of the economy was actually hit? What has the government done? How long will the pandemic influence economic activity? And of course, will there be any post-pandemic major change in consumer behavior? We went through all this, and we actually didn't end up with, if you will, anything that would suggest a 7-year recovery. The V was the only logical outcome. That is to say, not a perfect V, but rather a relatively rapid bounce back in terms of economic activity as we, of course, continue to get rid of this virus. So let's go ahead and zoom into the present. Let's go into those questions just a little bit, talk about where we were in the past, not the present. Why were we so confident? Remember where we were at the start of this thing. For example, payroll job growth had slowed quite a bit, but then again, reason for the slowing job growth in the United States was the fact that we had labor shortage problems. Remember, for 2.5 years prior to the pandemic, we had more job openings than we had people looking for work in the US economy. By the way, as a result of those tight labor markets, wages were rising. This is another centerpiece of my conversation. Whether you're looking at median or average real wages, once you look at the data right, turns out it was a very good expansion. Worker wage, take-home wages were going up. And the good news is not only were they making more money, but they weren't spending it all. Take a look at the left-hand side with the household savings rate. Prior to the Great Recession, the savings rates had dropped to a record low level. Prior to the pandemic, it had gotten back up to 8%, the highest it's been since the early 1990s. And when you start talking about, of course, savings, it's also worth talking something about the financial markets. I have to tell you how appalled I was watching all the hedge fund billionaires showing up on CNBC, telling everybody that this was about to be financial Armageddon, Great Recession meltdown part 2. Why would you say that out loud? Again, as noted, this is nothing like the Great Recession. The Great Recession occurred at the back end of a decade of amazingly excessive consumer borrowing. This time around, quite the opposite, because of Dodd-Frank's, because of just basic borrower fear, you had a relatively moderate decade of borrowing. And indeed, because of low interest rates, the financial obligations ratio, the share of household income spent on financial obligations had dropped to an all-time low level. Contrast that prior to the pandemic, Great Recession, when it was an all-time high level. And it wasn't just high income earners driving this. On the left-hand side, this is the ratio of debt payment to family income by overall income level. And again, across the board, for low income and high income households, overall debt payment to income ratios had fallen substantially. This was nothing like the Great Recession. And of course, there's not going to be the same sort of fallout. Why would all these guys show up on CNBC and call financial Armageddon? Well, that's a good way of getting Jerome Powell to open up his pocketbook and give you lots of money. And that's exactly what's happened. It's a good job if you can get it. What about real estate? This shocked me. Mark Zandi came out and said 15 million households could stop paying their mortgage if the U.S. economy remains closed this summer and beyond. 15 million? What are you talking about? Those are the kind of numbers we saw during the Great Recession. And again, this is not the same run-up as to the Great Recession. Look at the Case-Shiller Index. When I was with you at the start of the year, everybody was worried about the fact that in 2019, real estate was cold, not hot. Now, of course, as we came into the beginning of this year, real estate started to pick up a bit. And why wouldn't it? On the right-hand side, prior to the Great Recession, a record share of housing units for sale for rent. Prior to the pandemic, a record low share. Overall financial markets, getting more into that. You can see how clean the mortgage workers were. And one of the things about consumer debt markets in general, or debt markets in general, is that they do not turn on a dime. When you think of all the pain that occurred during the Great Recession in those financial markets, remember when they began. They didn't begin in 2008 when the recession began. You actually started seeing the problems in 2006 and 7. 2007 in particular, when I was making my calls in the Great Recession back then, I wasn't looking into a crystal ball and making future projections. I could already see the wheels falling off the train. You could already see the big increase in those delinquency rates. Now, what about the business side of things? Well, 2019 was actually not a very good year for business investment. Business investment was relatively weak. We came into the pandemic with a weak, although fundamentally strong economy. The big pullback, well, guess what? A lot of it had to do with mining. It wasn't, of course, to do with the Chinese trade war. It had to do with the massive excess supply, the oil glut in the global market. The big slowdown in 2019 was mostly generated a big pullback in investment in new oil wells. Then you had a little bit of pullback in commercial healthcare and a little bit on the transportation equipment side. Yes, some of this actually had to do with the trade war, but a small amount of it, most of it just had to do with changing dynamics, changing fundamentals in the economy. For example, the whole oil situation. You remember, we had oil at 50 bucks a barrel. Why? Well, because the U.S. is producing more oil than anybody else and well over 2.5 times as much as we did a decade ago. When you have too much oil, it's not much of a surprise, of course, that the overall pace of oil exploration would slow down. There are a lot of folks worried about what the pandemic meant for oil exploration. The answer to that is you can't really kill a dead man. We've already at the bottom of that particular sector. It's hard for it to fall much farther. And boy, it did get dramatic, didn't it, with oil prices plunging into negative territory for a short period of time. As for office and other types of industrial construction, again, as the numbers show, overall the things weren't that you did see a little bit of a slowdown in overall construction and permitting, but it's worth noting that there was a little bit of an uptick in vacancy rates and a little bit of a slowdown in rental growth. Nothing that would suggest a major oversupply. And after all, if you go back to looking at the overall data right here on the right-hand side, you can see just how moderate the investment in this cycle was in commercial real estate. It was not the traditional stuff. It wasn't office and industrial. It was more the mining and the manufacturing that have been growing like gangbusters. And of course, when you look in the overall non-residential spending in April, look, there's a lot of momentum overall. And the numbers nominally have been, well, relatively flat since about 2017 or so. So what it says to us is that the numbers basically have not fallen off a cliff. Momentum continues forward, but it doesn't look like there's going to be a big surge anytime in the near future. But as with consumer credit, commercial credit fundamentals were very, very good running into this thing. Now, where are we right now? Well, we're actually into the fourth quarter at this particular point in time. We haven't gotten third quarter numbers yet. The last big number, the number I think that's coloring so much of the national conversation about the economy, had to do, of course, with that negative 32% quarter we saw in the second quarter of the year. We've never seen anything like this. Now, how big of a number is that? The worst quarter ever prior to this was negative 10% overall. So this is 3 times as bad as that. And what this represents is overall, the fourth quarter of last year, the second quarter of this year, about 11% decline in real GDP. Again, worst we've ever seen. But most of this, of course, is pullbacks in consumer spending. And even in here, you can see, yet again, more reason to think that while this is an enormous change in economic dynamics, it's a transitory or really temporary type of change in the system. Take, for example, that well over a third of the pullback in consumer spending was healthcare. Now, why is that good news? Why is any pullback in consumer spending good news? The answer, of course, is that healthcare is not a cyclical sector. There wasn't one quarter of declining healthcare spending during the Great Recession. Every single quarter it went up, no matter how bad the economy was. And that's because most healthcare is paid for through insurance, whether it's public or private. If you need health care, you will get it for the most part. This thing slowed down, of course, sharply, not because there was a pullback in consumer demand, but because we were told by our doctors' offices and our hospitals, don't come in right now. We're not going to be end up being a vector to spread this particular disease. We're pushing back, and anything that it can be held off. Well, the good thing about that is that healthcare, this is spending delayed, not spending canceled. It's going to come back, and it already has in a big way. After that, you do see where the things are getting hit. Food and accommodation, recreation services, other transportation, other services. This is haircut, and of course, transportation. This is really the airlines. This is front and center on what's getting hit in this particular economy. But to be clear, let's think a little bit about what the COVID-19 business cycle looks like. First, there is the recession itself, driven, of course, by the panic and the public health mandates. This was the very start of it. And by the way, the recession itself, peak to trough, it is true that this is the deepest recession in U.S. economic history. It's also, by the way, shortest, as I'll show you in just a second. The bottom of economic activity was actually in April. That's how quick it was. And since then, the economy has been actually roaring back. Now, when you start thinking about roaring back, what we're talking about is the recovery period. This was a 2-month recession. The recession's over, and now we're in recovery. And that front, there's 3 major stages to think about. The first stage, of course, is learning to live with COVID. One of the things that all the doomsters forgot to talk about is the idea that people mitigate. You learn to live in these particular circumstances. Look, I have money. I'm still making income. I still want to live my life. I appreciate that I can't do things the way I could 2 months ago, but I'm learning to deal with it. I'm a business. I'm learning to deal with it. I'm learning how to get my people to work from home. I'm learning how to do this and do that. This is what we do. And it was an enormous part of the beginning of this. No one gave us a lot of, shall we say, credit for mitigation. Now, not everybody can mitigate. We understand that some sectors, say, for example, like Disneyland or conventions, these guys cannot operate while the virus is around, period. And as such, they can't mitigate. But at the same time, there are some winners out there, some sectors of the economy that are absolutely booming because of the fact that people can't do the things they want to do. They are doing other things instead. In other words, recovery stage 1 has a lot of winners and losers. Now, this one, we're doing great on. As I get you in the data in just a second, you'd be amazed by how much this economy has already bounced back. Now, recovery stage 2, this has to do with containing the disease. As already noted, while we are getting close to normal, we cannot get back to full normal until, of course, we get complete control of this virus, and that has not happened yet. Indeed, we can give this one a big X. Now, I understand you could immediately dive into criticism of this administration, and I won't obviously defend the Trump administration or its response to this entire situation, but I'll also say this. The idea that somehow or other Europe had it right and we had it wrong, that doesn't add up either. When you actually get a little deeper into the data, what you start to see very clearly is the obvious fact that, look, Europe hasn't fixed their problems either, despite having more draconian situations out there. There is no magic bullet on this particular situation. And we know we have to work harder, but how to do that is not as clear. And of course, in these political times, you can't even have an honest conversation about that. Part of it, of course, is we'll get in that just a second, is just accepting the inevitable, that you have to move down the resistance curves and think about policies, not so much to try to stop the virus, because you can't stop this virus, but rather to protect the vulnerable and minimize the impact on the economy. Last but not least is the stage is return to normality. And this is the one we still have to forecast, because stage one, we're through that. Stage two, we're still working on that. Stage three, that's what happens when we do contain the disease, as almost certainly will happen in the first or second quarter of next year. Well, at this point in time, I can say that return to normality, the last jump is going to be very quickly, in part because so far there's been modest long-run damage to the economy, plus the fact that massive government stimulus has supercharged the economy. But I'm going to throw an X in here as well, because one of the things that I am worried about is the idea that the excessive government reaction, and yeah, you heard that right, I'm going to come back to that too, the excessive government reaction has left us with the possibility of not only a very rapid debt crisis, but also the Federal Reserve is leaving us with the potential for inflation. In other words, we may have overreacted, thus creating more problems for the economy in the future. By the way, that's not unpredictable, given, of course, how we live in these crazy political times and the age of miserabilism, as I've used in the past. So let's get into these stages. Let's talk through them just quick. How did I come up with this, and why do I have these views? Well, again, let's talk about monthly GDP. This is data through August. We don't have September yet. It is possible to get monthly GDP. Basically, you're using some of the monthly data we have with some interpolations, if you will, of some of the more quarterly statistics. This is February right here, March and April. This is the decline. Remember, recessions are peak to trough. The trough clearly occurred in April. Yes, you heard it right. This is a 2-month recession. And of course, the economy has been leaping back. Not all the way. We've gotten all the way back, but we're not quite there. Still, even with this big bounce right here, we're lining up right now for a 35% growth rate in the third quarter of the year. That's the number. That's what you're going to see, 35, perhaps even as high as 36%. The number's already baked in, the data we have. So we are going to see the biggest quarter of growth ever in the history of the United States, but we're not all the way back. We're still off about 3.7%, which is pretty significant. Now, again, this goes back to the idea that we haven't gotten full control over the virus, and until you get full control of the virus, you can't fully mitigate. Now, what's driving the show, the rebound up till now, of course, is real consumer spending. Remember, they're the ones that pulled back so sharply at the start of this, and they're the ones driving the recovery. But again, winners and losers. On the left-hand side is real consumer spending, monthly data, and you can see services are still well below the February peak. On the other side, however, goods are well above where they were back in February. What's happening here? Well, again, people can't spend money on some of the stuff they want to. I can't go get my doctor's appointment. I can't take my family to Disneyland. Ergo, I'm going to go out and buy myself a camper. I'm going to buy a tent. I'm going to buy stuff to amuse myself while I'm waiting for the world to reopen. The numbers are pretty amazing. Take, for example, retail sales, getting rid of restaurants. Well, those have been above trend for 3 months now. And yet again, winners and losers. Take a look at the left-hand side. Here's one winner, the internet. You know, the retail, brick and mortar retail already had a huge problem with the online world. And we all know about that, Jeff Bezos moving forward. But even as of the start of the year, e-commerce we're still only about, a little less than 12% of overall retail sales. But then, of course, when this thing hit, everybody started moving online, and it's absolutely exploded. No matter what happens, retail, brick and mortar retail is going to come out of this looking rough. And it isn't, again, because of the pandemic specifically, rather the pandemic is simply accelerating an underlying trend of the economy. But you can see who else is doing great. Hardware is doing great. Boy, Lowe's, Home Depots, these guys are busy as all get out. Sports and hobbies, they're doing great. Motor vehicles have bounced back nicely. Supermarkets doing well. Those at the bottom, well, restaurants, of course, gasoline, clothing. These sectors of the economy are absolutely suffering right now. But again, take a look at hardware, tells you what people are focusing on. And take a look at the bounce we've seen. This is amazing on the left-hand side because, you know, at the beginning of this, people stopped spending money and retailers got stuck with tons of inventory. Nobody was buying, stuff was getting shipped in, and they had a real problem on their hand. And when inventory to sales ratios go up, that's an enormous, that's when you talk about enormous supply chain effects. And we started seeing that rippling through the system at the start of this. But because retail spending came roaring back, we went from one extreme to the other, from a very high inventory to sales ratio to an incredibly low one, because retailers were caught completely off guard. And now they're around ordering stuff, trying to catch up on their inventories. Industrial production has bounced back, not all the way. Again, there is still some disruptions out there, but it's bounced back quite a bit. And take a look at manufacturing. This is U.S. manufacturing sector. Again, the big bump up in inventory to sales ratios, now, of course, coming back down as spending gets cut back up. This is good news because, of course, now that we're getting back to normal levels of inventory to sales, again, it means industrial production should continue to move forward. On the right-hand side, the non-defense, non-airline durable orders, again, very, very solid bounce back. Everything suggests things are getting back into a normal plane. Some places are still behind. For example, what's one thing that's way behind? Aircraft orders. Not a big surprise. I'm going to show you some of that data later on. You still have only 40% of the air traffic you had last year at this particular point in time. Another big surprise for all those doom and gloomers out there, not the least of which, of course, was Mark Zandi, was the housing market, which we heard was going to absolutely collapse. A couple really bad months for overall sales before they came roaring back. Whether you're looking at new home sales, existing home sales, there is phenomenal demand out there right now, and it's rippling through the system. The Case-Shiller numbers, which showed a tiny bit of slowdown, have bounced back very, very sharply. Here's housing starts coming into September of this particular year. The single-family market is really bouncing back. Multifamily a little soft right now. Not much of a surprise after all. I mean, there are a lot of people saying multifamily has big problems. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it has become, if you will, conventional wisdom. You see a lot of eviction moratoriums going into place. And needless to say, investors are not really interested in investing in that kind of market. But the single family market, well, again, look at that September number. This is the best number, well over 1 million units, seasonally adjusted annualized, since going back really into the Great Recession itself, pre-Great Recession. So really solid numbers in this particular thing. And you can see a very similar trend. California see a big bounce, Oregon a little bit, Washington's a little bit, but multifamily soft across the board. Better news, of course, again, overall housing permits. That is to say about things that will drive starts in a couple months. Again, to be very, very solid. It's going to be a great rest of the year for housing. This part of the economy is moving forward. And while I don't have good data for national inventories, you can certainly see here in California, for example, how months supply of inventories are at a record low level right now. So this is a housing market that is doing absolutely fantastic. As for the commercial markets, well, a little bit of a mixed bag. You know, it's interesting. We'll get into this a little bit near the end of the conversation, but when you think about the three major types of commercial real estate out there, the industrial guys have proven their worth. Local distribution is where it's at. You can see, of course, overall asking growth is doing great. Pretty much everybody is an expanding market right now. Yeah, Houston's a little weak. That's oil. And you can see a few of these guys a little softer over here. But for the most part, industrial is doing great. Office, on the other hand, is pretty much decelerating. Again, no major blood in the water at this point in time. But all these people working from home has gotten office investors thinking, well, maybe there won't be a big bounce back in office demand at the back end of this. And as a result of that, things are softening just a bit. But of course, and transactions have slowed up a lot. Commercial property prices are soft. But again, this is not an unsurprising degree of panic occurring in the midst of a relatively unique situation. Take, for example, the transaction volumes. Transaction volumes have dropped mainly because, well, if you were a buyer at the start of this thing, you'd be silly not to pull out of that transaction. Why not? You might get better terms, as the case may be. You know, and again, you see permits down just a little bit, but overall spending doing just fine. As for credit issues themselves, again, credit numbers, nothing to see here, folks. Financial volatility has cooled off. no problems in delinquency rates in the second quarter of the year. Yes, it is true that overall bank lending has slowed and banks are tightening standards. They're in the midst of a panic. But again, let's separate. You got to panic because of the assumption that there's going to be real world problems. Well, there's not going to be any real world problems. We don't have an oversupply. We don't have too much borrowing. We don't have all the issues that were in, if you will, the midst of the commercial market prior to the Great Recession. So this on the left-hand side is a temporary panic. It's going to fade off as we get into the third quarter of the year, no doubt about it. Most important, of course, particularly for when you think of your industry and what you guys do, well, imports and exports. Exports and imports both fell off a cliff at the beginning of this thing, but you have seen, again, the rebound in activity. Not so much for exports. They're still pretty far below where they were pre-pandemic, but imports getting back up. They're almost back to where they were at the end of last year. Again, bouncing back nicely relative to the big slowdown. And of course, with the dollar being relatively high value, you got some buying power at this particular point in time. Here's some of the data on exports. Again, overall, catching up just a bit. Canada, we're down most places of the world. Interestingly enough, not China. So China is actually buying our stuff in the midst of all this. As for imports, well, similar sort of picture. You look at the number here. Imports are down pretty much from everywhere, with the exception of a few like Vietnam and of course Taiwan. Some of this, of course, are people moving around, if you will, some of those tariffs that are still on Chinese products, but overall imports getting back up and running relatively quickly. Looking at different types of commodities, I won't go too deep into this data. I'll let you peruse these on your own. But again, you can see how while year over year, things are still relatively weak. On the export side, imports, things have bounced back nicely, particularly on the pharmaceutical front, organic chemical front. Things are moving forward. And according to the fastener sector themselves, if you look at exports, they're down, imports down as well. But if you went on the month to month, you do things catching up. I mean, after all, you think about the Home Depots, you think about the housing market, things are in demand. There's going to be demand for these products. And you can see some of the shifting going on, right? So for example, this is some of the old breakdown of fasteners. I showed you some of this data at the start of the year. This is your August of the year. Taiwan, while down from overall year, still the big import source. It's interesting, China's down pretty much more than, and Japan are down the most of these groups. Taiwan not down so much. Get into this category, get into the anchors and part of things, a relatively small part of the market. China basically dominates this, but it's down. But all of a sudden, we're buying all sorts of stuff from Spain. Not sure what's going on there, as the case may be. And then you get into the nails, tax, drawing bins. Again, down about 12% overall, 10% from China. Really, China has actually, for overall, done relatively well in this one particular sector. But again, the big part of it in terms of bolts, nuts, and screws, looks like Taiwan, of course, is the big winner there on that particular front. Now, while all this economy was roaring back, we had something else that came back as well, and that, of course, was the COVID recession itself. And this is a number of new confirmed cases. Showing you, of course, this is the number of cases per million people, and you can see the second surge over the summer, and now we're entering into the third surge. You can see the problems in the European Union and in the United Kingdom as well. Again, it's a complicated conversation about who's right and who's wrong, and it isn't as clear as what you hear in the press. Clearly, this thing is hard to get rid of. How you can eventually get rid of it's hard to say. One of the things I will talk about in a few minutes is the idea that it does seem like you just have to have a certain proportion of your population exposed to it in order to get full control over it. For example, you took in the United States and where we are, this is New York. New York and New Jersey, of course, were the first round. They have a terrible problem there, but now not so much going on. The second big wave was Arizona and Florida, big hits, but look how much their cases have come down at this particular point in time. As for now, this new surge, well, this is places that haven't been hit yet. This is mainly Midwest. You're talking the Dakotas, Montana, Wisconsin, Illinois, and these folks are now moving through it. It is interesting. It seems as if you've already been exposed to a number of cases, you can control it relatively with a degree of effort. If, however, you've not had any or not have a significant number of cases, it's very, very difficult to control this thing. More important, however, and this is something again that doesn't get discussed anywhere near enough, despite the fact that we had a big second wave of this, we had no second recession. The only thing you say is over the summer, the recovery slowed down just a little bit. That's all you can say. Amazing how well our economy showed its resilience. Yeah, you didn't hear about this at all in the newspapers. Everybody has all sorts of negative things to say about the economy. No one points out the obvious, which is, guess what? We've done a heck of a job learning to live with COVID. And I went through all those numbers for you. Now, in terms of the impacted sectors, well, not all of them are back. Take a look here. Obviously, travel's way down. If you're bringing fasteners in for airplanes, that market's going to be relatively quiet. Healthcare's bounced back very nicely. And of course, in the middle there, that's hotels and restaurants. That's getting relatively weak, as the case may be. Travel trends are behind, but winners and losers are really important here to focus on. Daily occupancy rates coming into the summer are running about 45–50%, substantially below where we were last year at this point in time. But with that in mind, it's also worth noting that when you think about the who's doing well and who's not, you can basically answer that question by asking, how do people go to that hotel? If it's on an airplane, they're dead. If they're driving up, they're very busy. And that we're seeing that across California, for example. This is anecdotal, but you know, you go to Anaheim and all those hotels obviously are empty. A lot of them aren't even open. Yet you go down to the Orange County coast and those hotels are busy as all get out because people want to get out of the house and they are going there. So until this thing gets controlled and people are willing to fly on airplanes again on a regular basis, certain parts of the travel industry remain shut down, but other parts are actually doing fine. The biggest lagging indicator of all, of course, is payroll jobs. And this one, of course, gets an awful lot of attention in the press, and well, it should. I understand. When you think about jobs, it's probably the single most human face you can put on these kind of situations. But it can be excessively exaggerated. And again, I think a lot of the data going on out there has been relatively misinterpreted. For example, I appreciate we are down, about 9 million jobs from where we were. That's about 7.5% at this particular point in time. And that pain is particularly felt again in those sectors: recreation, accommodation of food, other services. But we have come back quite a bit. And the way to think about that gets into this whole idea about even why we didn't believe the unemployment numbers up front and why everybody else was so negative. One of the reasons why people were so negative is that history says that when unemployment goes up, it takes a long time to come down. And that, you know, you take a look at the Great Recession, right? It took years and years and years for this thing to get back down to normal levels. But this was not that kind of unemployment. The beginning of this thing, all the unemployment were people who were on temporary layoff. Temporary layoff. That is not a true job loss. That's somebody who says, hey, I have a job, I just can't go to it now because of COVID-19. Now, most of those people have actually gone back to work. Some have lost their jobs permanently, but most have actually gone back to work. And when you think about the overall unemployment rate right now, which is about 7.8%, realize that the actual number of people who are truly without a job, that is to say the truly unemployed, that is now running about 4.7%. Context, during the very mild tech recession, it was about 5.4%. What this says is once you strip out the crazy transitory nature of this thing, the big shutdown because of the presence of COVID, take that out, what you see is a very mild recession going on in the background, driven, of course, by that particular movement through the cycle. So yeah, it's there, but the permanent damage is very, very lean. And if you take a look at, for example, job openings, take how this number has bounced back. Again, during the Great Recession, it dropped off through the Great Recession and didn't get back to Great Recession peaks till 2014. This time it dropped and is already almost back to where it was pre-COVID. Amazingly fast. And while I appreciate that the thing that you love, that journalists love to talk about are these continued claims, I would note that continued claims data for the United States suggests that there are more people receiving unemployment than there are people who are claiming to be unemployed. Now you said, wait a minute, how is that possible? And the answer is rampant fraud. In fact, 2 days ago, we got a newspaper article here in California, which I thought was quite funny. A rap artist here in Los Angeles released a song called EDD, where he was bragging about basically committing fraud on unemployment insurance claims. And in the video, he was throwing around EDD debit cards. And of course, he got arrested for this because you're not allowed to do that. But unfortunately, I can't look at the continued claims right now as much in the way of data. You got to focus on unemployment. Remember, it's already down to 7.7%. What about the K-shaped recovery? That's the new big term. Well, to be clear, the idea of the K-shaped recovery is this. That is to say, the low-skilled folks are not coming back where high-skilled folks are. Well, every recovery is a K-shaped recovery at some level because low-skilled folks always see their fortunes lag through business cycles. They always do. There's nothing new about that. But it's a mistake to say that things haven't gotten better. They absolutely have. This is unemployment by education. You can see those without a high school degree surge up to 22%. And as of August, at least, it was down to about 13%. It is coming down rapidly. In fact, more rapidly than it is for people with a bachelor degree or more. So yes, those folks are still suffering, but things are getting better. And indeed, if you look at overall job openings, interestingly enough, job openings for low-skilled people are just about where they were prior to the pandemic. It's job openings for high-skilled folks that's lagging behind. So it isn't really a K-shaped recovery. For some high-skilled folks, particularly those newly entering the workforce, say a recent college grad, things look pretty bad. For some lower-skilled folks, particularly who are in the restaurant industry, who might be in the services industry, again, things look still pretty bad. But again, there are job openings out there for them if they want to look in other parts of the economy. Now, probably the thing that most worries folks, and understandably, is the idea about small businesses going bankrupt. And I appreciate that. Yes, there are a lot of small businesses who aren't going to make it through. But again, to be clear, small businesses always have a tremendous churn. They're always entering and leaving the economy at a far more rapid pace than large companies are. That's just the nature of the sector. And as many small firms may be going bankrupt right now, there are also plenty of entrepreneurs out there starting up their next business. This is California business applications, although it's reflected very well in the national data. You can see the enormous surge. Indeed, in California, the number of new business applications is the highest it's been since they started collecting this data back in January of 2006. This, again, is a big deal. It suggests that there is a life after COVID. Now, that depends, of course, on getting COVID under control. And I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about that. Look, one of the things to keep in mind here, if you couldn't already tell, is that those places that truly shut down, such as Europe, didn't succeed. It's come roaring back. And indeed, places such as, for example, Sweden and Japan, which never closed down, don't really have all that big of a problem right now. And it begs the question, and of course, here in the United States, we don't seem to have much of a policy at all, or at least it's all state run, which means in some places like Arizona, it's not very tough, where in places like California, it is. What's the right way of thinking about this? How does one get this under control? Are we expecting another giant wave that could cause this mild recession to turn into something much deeper? Well, the answer, of course, seems to be very simple, that the best way of getting through this thing is to make sure that a certain proportion of your population actually has some innate resistance. Now, that resistance can come from two forms. One is it's innate, it's already there. Two, you've actually been exposed to the virus, and ergo, you have some resistance if the thing should come around again. Basically, you've heard this term herd immunity. But the mistake here is thinking that herd immunity is somehow or other a 0 or 1 condition. Like the virus can spread out of control like crazy until you have herd immunity. Actually, no. When you have herd immunity, the virus can't spread at all. But if you have some population with resistance, you have some control over the virus, as the case may be. And overall, it seems as if just making sure a portion of the population is exposed to this thing is a way, of course, of getting control over it ultimately. Now, what portion of the population? This thing is dangerous, but it isn't equally dangerous for everybody. On the right-hand side is a breakdown of those who've unfortunately passed because of COVID-19, and it is absolutely the case. It is largely older folks. Younger folks, college-age folks, have very little to fear about this. I'm always amazed, of course, by how everybody's so upset about COVID ripping through college campuses. To me, having COVID rip through college campuses seems like a logical way of learning how to deal with this virus by getting that portion of the population who is relatively unharmed by this, basically to be, if you will, some level of immunity. Now, why they're going through that, obviously, you don't want them going home to visit grandma. It goes back to the idea that it's not about willy-nilly shutting the economy down or doing nothing at all. It's about using policies to protect those that need to be protected, because there are those people out there, while you let other people go about living their lives as they might choose to. It's a tough road to walk down. There's no doubt about it. It's very narrow. And sadly, again, in this hyper-political environment, it's hard to have these kind of conversations without it being twisted into something else. But eventually, we will get down that curve ultimately. We know when it gets to place, and when it does, this thing will be largely under control one way or the other, even if we don't actually happen to have a vaccine by that point in time. What happens then? How fast will the economy come back? Well, this comes back and led to my last point, which is about the policy overreaction of our federal government and the Federal Reserve. $3 trillion in stimulus. Through the Great Recession, which was a far more difficult type situation, far more dangerous to the economy, there was $1 trillion in stimulus. This time, $3 trillion in stimulus for a recession that is nowhere near as bad from any fundamental standpoint. We went from being underwhelming to being overwhelming. In fact, I would argue almost dangerously so. And, you know, don't get me wrong, clearly this had some value, expanding the unemployment program to get money to people who are actually unemployed rather than just somebody who knows how to fill out applications online. Good stuff. PPP loans that went to truly hurt businesses. Good stuff. But the rest of the money didn't make a lot of sense to me. Remember, the big problem we have in this particular COVID-19 recession is that people can't spend money. So how is our federal government dealing with that? They're giving people more money to spend. Well, wait a second, time out. If you're giving people money to spend that they can't spend, how is that helping the economy? The answer, of course, is it isn't, it can't, but it can help the recovery if you give it time. And that's why I get so frustrated with the calls that we desperately need a second stimulus package. We don't. We need to let the first one kick in, and that's not going to fully occur until, of course, we get control over the virus. Now, what do I mean by this in terms of this excessive response? Look, as dramatic as the numbers were in terms of employment, it's worth remembering so many of those jobs came out of very low income part-time sectors. Restaurants, retail, would be at personal care. This is not a big part of the income pool. And take a look at personal income on the left-hand side here. This is monthly data, and you can see this is where COVID begins right about here. And this is overall disposable personal income. Yes, it went up in the beginning of this thing, crazy, amazingly. Why? Well, for every dollar of lost income, the federal government put back $2, 2 to 1. Oh, so right off the bat, you're like, wow, that's a lot of money. And then people can't spend it. So where's it going? Into savings. It's amazing to me, right? How much money has been tossed at the economy and how it's still sitting there waiting to be effective if we give it time. Look on the right-hand side. Look how savings rates have gone through the roof. And here's another way of looking at it. And again, to me, it both gives me a little bit of comfort that we did some of the right stuff and a lot of comfort that this is going to come out and get our economy roaring. This is spending by levels of household income. At the low end, those who are low-income households, their spending on average is about the same as pre-COVID. Now, I understand some households are suffering because they don't have a job. Others are doing great because they got the extra money and maybe they're working Home Depot and they're getting overtime hours because they're so busy. So winners and losers, no doubt about it. Then you get to high-income households. Well, here's the answer. If you're a high-income household, you started this pandemic a winner. Now, you're not spending as much as you were, but that's because you're not able to bring your kids to Disneyland. Your spending is behind, but you're also the one who's accumulating cash like nobody's business. How much? Well, if you're not going to focus on anything in this entire presentation, focus on this one slide. On the left-hand side, this is bank deposits. This is in commercial banking system, and you can see the nice smooth trend in terms of growing deposits until right about here when the numbers absolutely explode. And yes, your eyes are not deceive you, about $2.5 trillion in excess deposits. So we have a $3 trillion stimulus plan, and that basically created $2.5 trillion in excess deposits in the banking system. There is your stimulus plan waiting to be spent. And of that 2.5 trillion, by the way, over half of that is excess household savings. This isn't corporations tucking the money away, it's households tucking the money away. Well over half that amount is household excess spending. There is so much dry powder out there that will be spent once we get the virus under control. Don't worry about a number of stimulus. Worry about the fact that the federal government's going to be borrowing $3 to $4 trillion this year. Now, this is not a problem. After all, they're borrowing all this money. Where are they borrowing it from? Who's borrowing those bonds? Banks are. Why? because banks have 2.5 trillion in new deposits they don't know what to do with because they're not lending very much. But what happens when, the economy gets back upright again? What happens when consumers do start spending and businesses do start investing again? And of course, the government is trying to borrow 3 to 4 trillion. Context, always good. In 2019, all borrowing, state, federal, private, public, business, consumer, together was a little over 3 trillion. This year alone, the federal government's going to be borrowing almost 4 trillion. Does that sound like a potential for higher interest rates? Absolutely. I have not said this in the last decade, but right now I do see the potential for higher interest rates. And while we're at it, let's talk about the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has engaged in quantitative easing more aggressively than they did during the Great Recession. Look at the crazy increase in the Fed balance sheet. 3 trillion. That's just nothing relative to what Ben Bernanke did during the Great Recession. Now, what does this mean? Why are they doing it? Well, I don't know why they're doing it, for one thing. For example, the reason you had to put so much money into the economy back then was because of the collapse in monetary velocity, because of the collapse in household wealth. We don't have any of that. Remember, spending is roaring back. We're significantly closer to the pre-peak now than we were just a couple of months ago. And as for wealth, it fell in the first quarter of the year with a big stock market panic, and then it bounced back in the second quarter of the year as the stock market rallied. Housing market, of course, is at picking up speed, and people are borrowing money and they're investing in new homes. There's no collapse in wealth out there. Ergo, why are you doing this? I don't know. Look at this graph. Again, warning. On the left-hand side here, inflation, which cooled off a bit, has already started to pick back up again. Already, not weeks, not months, just that quick. I mean, not years rather, but months, it's back in. And of course, with all this quantitative easing, look at M2 growth. We've never seen money supply growth like this. Is this inflationary? You bet your bottom dollar it is. Now, inflation takes a few years to kick in. But when you think about back in the 70s, when we were growing the money supply of 13, 14% per year for a couple of years, well, that led to inflation. This time we're doing something very similar, and I am actually worried about this. So, long run, business, consumer behavior. What about after all this comes to an end? Will there be a major shift in the economy? And the answer is no, there will not. The new normal conversation. There's nothing new about pandemics. Pandemics have been with civilization since the dawn of civilization. There is no evidence that whether it's a Spanish flu or MERS or SARS or terrorism, none of there are natural disasters, none of these things create permanent changes in consumer behavior. And I appreciate some segments are going to lag, older consumers, as the case may be, global tourism, but people are not going to change their behavior. Rather, this is about accelerating what I would call existing trends. For example, de-retailing. We know, of course, that retail is getting eaten up because of the internet. At some point in time, we got to figure out what to do with our retail land use. But that's accelerating an existing trend. As for business issues, well, you can see the shakeout in stress sectors, retail again, but perhaps overall there's some good lessons here. And one of the interesting ones, of course, has to do with office. And of course, the fact that people have learned that, well, working remotely can be done. My company has done that. My folks have been working out of their homes since April, and I've been amazed by how well they've been doing. Very, very pleased at how well this has gone. But with that in mind, I don't think we're closing down our office anytime in the near future. Why? Because while working remotely can work in some cases, in other cases, whether it's training, whether it's a collaboration process, whether it's dealing with clients, you still need people in the office. And of course, at the same time, workers who at one point in time dreamed of being able to work from home have now realized that it isn't all that fun, that once in a while it's nice to go out to lunch with your colleagues. So what I think here is you want to talk about the big commercial types of space. Office, medium. Retail, collapse. Industrial, very solid. But again, this is the kind of thing you're going to see over the course of the next couple of years. So where do we wrap up? Well, look, the long run still matters. Most important. We have become singularly obsessed with what's going on with COVID-19. And for the most part, we've forgotten the future. And that is dangerous. It isn't good. Obviously, it's a national tragedy. It's a natural disaster. 250,000+ people have passed. Families have suffered because of that. But as much as the COVID-19 situation itself is tragic, the economy is learning to deal with it. As already noted, the V is the only logical outcome, and we are well into the V at this point in time. Now, getting back to normal is dictated by the pace at which we get the virus fully under control. And that in turn is based really on correct behavior. It's not policy. It's not government running around being willy-nilly shutting down the economy. It's about personal behavior. What can you expect? Well, as I already noted, 36% growth in the Q3, 8% in the Q4. We see the economy being pretty back to normal by the middle of last year. Some very moderate upticks in debt distress, but very, very moderate. Stock market, who knows? But little impact overall in long run. Real estate values, obviously retail, restaurants, tourism, that's going to lag a bit. There are always wild cards. When I was with you earlier in the year, the big wild card was COVID-19. The big wild card this time is wave 2, not surge 2. Remember, the surges we've seen up till now is the virus simply getting in a place that it hasn't been yet. I don't think there's going to be a second wave because coronaviruses don't mutate the way flus do. They don't tend to pass through places they've already been in any kind of substantial way. So I don't think there'll be a second round, but then again, we just don't know. Obviously, the global situation, where there's a lot of global disruption out there, a lot of countries are just getting through this. Europe is having problems again. And you have the government budget situation. Particularly, it isn't, federal government spending like crazy. They're going to be borrowing too much. That's going to constrain them in a year or so. Local governments are getting hit. And of course, state governments are falling behind because of unemployment benefit payouts and so on and so forth. You start thinking of all that, this probably would take some bite out of infrastructure investments. Yet again, that's a bit of a problem. We'll see how that works. But in the end, obviously, the real problem here is miserabilism. Our inability to have an honest conversation about our economy, about where it's getting, about the policies we need to make the economy grow in a good way. Instead, of course, we have allowed our panic to overwhelm us. And as a result of that, you have a federal government who's borrowing too much. You have a Federal Reserve who's printing too much money. You have a lot of willy-nilly, crazy sort of conversations about policy, a lot of finger pointing, and none of this needs to be done. I appreciate that there's some uncomfortable math. It's going to be very interesting in a year when things do calm down and we can look back on this and think about what we did do right and we didn't do right. And my guess is we're going to end up in a completely different place than they did it right and we did it wrong, or we did it right and they did it wrong. For me, this miserabilism, this issue, I mean, here we had an opportunity to truly pull together as a country, to truly pull together and work together to get control over this situation. And that didn't happen. Instead, even something as simple as wearing a mask has turned into a political punching bag. And I don't understand that. I just don't. But again, from an economic perspective, what I see is not this crazy political stuff. What I see is a whole bunch of smart, hardworking people figuring out how to deal with this thing on a day-to-day basis and doing so very well. The economy is getting back. It's going to continue to. We're going to be back up and running faster than you might think. But of course, with the legacy, if you will, of the political fallout, the potential for inflation, and of course, the potential for higher interest rates because of that overall federal budget situation. So I will wrap up there. We went a lot of space, I know that. And let me go ahead and get back to our slide. And with that, let's go ahead and turn it over for questions and answers.
Thank you. That was, as usual, a great presentation. And I really like your suggestion. Let's just get all the college kids sick. I agree. I think that's great. All right. So let's read. I'm going to say it again for questions. Type it in. If you just type it in, I will read it. You can certainly type in, unmute me, or raise your hand. So we'll give them a few minutes, but I will, a question did come in a few slides ago, so I'm going to tell you where you are at, and then I'll read the question. You were discussing the spending, the recovery, the stimulus money, and how a lot of people just deposited into their bank accounts. So that's the slide you were on. The question was, but just because it was deposited doesn't mean it was just sitting there, right? Do we actually think that none of that money was spent?
Well, what I mean by that is when you look at some of it was spent, obviously, in as much as you see consumer spending coming back pretty strongly. You know that that some business investments coming back, durable goods orders is picking up. What I mean is all of it hasn't been spent, right? And by the way, that's very current data. So look, some of the stimulus money may have done some good. And I think that certain parts, like the expansion of unemployment, made a lot of sense. I think some of the loans that they did, some of the PPP loans made sense. The problem with the program, it was vastly too generous. It wasn't well controlled. Fraud and abuse everywhere. I mean, do you know how many law firms and accounting firms got PPP loans? Can someone explain to me why accounting firms and law firms needed those? They didn't. Why did they get them? Well, they were first in line. That's not how you run a stimulus package. You worry about helping the people who are hurting, not just throwing money willy-nilly at the economy. So, and again, yeah, I think most of that money is, I mean, remember, spending has come back, but not all the way. So, not sure if I answered that, but you kind of see my point.
Thank you. The next question is, will the economy change based on who wins the presidency?
Yeah, that's what everybody's asking me right now.
No pressure.
Yeah. I think it's worth remembering that the minority parties in this country have power, right? You know, Obama had 2 years where he had a full house and he got the Affordable Care Act passed, and that's about it. He didn't really have much control after that. Trump had a full house for 2 years. The only thing he got done in any substantial way, of course, is the tax cut that he put into place. So one would say that the economy, the politics can't change rapidly, period. Doesn't matter who wins. It's just, you know, you're going to see a lot of this loggerheads going on. So that would say no. Now, mind you, obviously they will, as individuals, pursue vastly different policies. And, you know, I could go through an entire list of whose policies are what and what might be better and what might be worse. It's probably too complex to talk about right now, particularly since, again, what they actually focus on is going to be a completely different conversation. What they can actually get done, that's a completely different conversation. What I am hopeful for ultimately is you know, Trump, of course, has become so politically polarized. It's as simple as that. And if Biden comes in, if he can build relationships with the other side of the aisle, perhaps we may get to a point where the two parties can actually compromise and get, for example, an appropriate infrastructure bill, an appropriate immigration bill passed. That would be my hope. The main difference seems to be that Trump has been busily burning his bridges, whereas Biden hasn't burned his yet. Now, maybe he will, hard to say, but you know, that would be my major call on the two individuals at this point in time.
All right, well done. Very Switzerlandish. And we have a group of young fastener professionals, and apologies that if we insulted all of you based on our college comment, that all the college kids can get sick.
Well, my point here is, and I appreciate that can be controversial, but again, you look at the data, everybody has to make a decision about how much you're afraid of this virus versus how much you want to live your life, right? We all make these decisions on a day-to-day basis. We make that decision every time we pick up a beer and drink it, right? Every time we eat a hamburger, we're making that decision. Every time we get in a fast car on a motorcycle, we're making that decision. We're taking risks for personal enjoyment. When you think about young folks, really anybody under 45, there's almost no fatalities from this thing. Almost none. I mean, really, if you look at the bulk, if you looked at that fatality data, again, it's older folks. They're the ones who are afraid of this. Now go to the next step. Shutting down the economy completely in Europe didn't work. It's roaring back there now. Again, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but it does suggest at some level, this disease has to get through a portion of the population before you can get it truly under control. That portion of the population would be the under 45 crowd. That's the logical determination. Now, again, it's uncomfortable math. We live in a world where that kind of uncomfortable math, I get some people upset, but unfortunately, it's a real calculation, and it's a calculation again that we all make on an individual basis, on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot of truth in that comment.
I concur. All right, our next question, I'm going to unmute Hans Fuller. Let's hope we don't have any technical issues. All right. It's not working. You're self-muted, Hans. All right, we're going to move on to the next question so that we don't hold you up. All right, next question. The extra $300 added to unemployment payments is making it hard to find entry-level employees. Any advice?
Well, that's the job openings conversation, right? Yeah, no doubt about it. Some people are indeed enjoying those unemployment benefits. Now, look, those unemployment benefits are going to come to an end eventually. Maybe that's what your help wanted side needs to make. Yeah, look, I have a job opening now. I won't when your $300 runs out. How about putting that sign on your door, right? So you just got to keep looking. We know folks are out there. Yeah, it is what it is.
All right, thank you. Next question. Just making sure I understood. Do you feel that the infrastructure spending will be the odd man out in terms of Fed spending? Sorry, I debacled that.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I got it. I think my point is this: we have yet to get a national infrastructure bill passed. And to be clear, when you look at that, I remember we had this conversation. I think it started at the beginning of the year when I was there with you. I was showing you some data on how it's really the federal government that has backed off. State governments are actually spending money on infrastructure, but they can only spend so much. And of course, they're going to get hurt right now because they're going to have all this debt built up because they had unemployment insurance. They're going to have to deal with the local governments. So there is a real problem out there with state and local governments being able to spend money over the next couple of years as they're cleaning up their balance sheets. That suggests that the federal government needs to now more than ever get back in the business of helping local governments invest in infrastructure. Now, will they? Will it happen? Again, so hard to say under this political environment. Trump's had 4 years. He's gotten nothing done. If Biden wins, he'll have an opportunity to get something passed. We'll see.
All right, thank you. Next question. Not to turn this into a completely political discussion, but do you think term limits would be good or bad for the economy?
Well, for that, I'm not sure who asked that question, but I will tell you, we have term limits in California for local politicians, not for our federals, and it's been a complete disaster. Now, I appreciate that when you have people just staying in government for a long time, it feels like they become so powerful that they're not beholden to anybody. Maybe, but at the same time, you need people who actually understand their jobs. I'm amazed. Running government is an incredibly complex job. How would you like to have a term limits on doctors? Well, every 8 years, we just got to turn over all the doctor community. The whole medical community's got to turn over. I wouldn't like that. I want somebody who's been doing this stuff for a long time, who has experience, understands what needs to be pushed and prodded. So no, I don't believe in term limits. You need people who understand the business of government. And excessive turnover basically means every 2 years you're trying to train people just to understand what the damn light switch is. And it's hard to get good policy in place with amateur government.
Thank you. Next question. How are states like California dealing with their declining economy due to lockdowns and their increasing debt?
Well, we're not increasing debt. I mean, the state is at some level because of unemployment, but there's no real increases in debt. But what was the first part of that question? Just how are
states like California dealing with their declining economy due to lockdowns and their increasing debt?
Well, how's everybody doing it, right? I mean, everybody's suffering at some level. It isn't just California. Now, California is looking a little worse than the nation overall, mainly because tourism is a big part of the local economy here. Now, if you think about, say, California versus Arizona or California versus Florida, obviously we're using more restrictions. I think at some level we probably had modestly fewer cases and modestly fewer deaths than Florida and Arizona as a result of that. But at the same time, I think we're probably keeping the economy closed too long, as the case may be. Arizona and Florida have had a more laissez-faire approach to this, and I think ultimately we'll probably look at those states as people kind of did it right. Now, again, that's not everybody's going to agree with that. If you've lost a loved one in Arizona, you're probably screaming at me right now, what a jerk, how dare you say that out loud. It's like I said, it's uncomfortable math. We have to figure out how to deal with this thing in some logical way, and I appreciate that you're not going to make everybody happy in this conversation.
All right, thank you. Do you see the continuing of tariffs, especially pertaining to our industry, as the world opens up?
Well, that goes back to the election, right? I mean, look, if Trump wins, no way those tariffs are going away. He's angry at China. He kind of blames China at some level for his political fortunes or lack thereof right now because of the pandemic. On the other side of the equation, you know, I'm not sure Biden would come in and want to reverse track on China. China is not exactly popular right now in the United States for any number of reasons. So clearly, if Trump wins, tariffs stay in place. If Biden comes in, my guess is he will probably back off on them, mainly because it's doing something that Trump did, undoing something that Trump did, not because it's necessarily logical. That's how I see things shaking out. But remember, ultimately, we still have, if you will, the upper hand on China. They still sell a lot more stuff than we do to them. Yuan has bounced back just a little bit, but still, it's still pretty cheap from a long run standpoint. We haven't really suffered that much from the tariffs, like we pointed out at the start of the year. It's been maybe some small amount of pass through, but not as much as a lot of the doomsters said at the beginning of this thing. So we'll see. What I will tell you, if they get rid of the tariffs, you can look for less deals and a stronger yuan to offset some of that.
All right, that was a lot of questions. I think I'll give it a minute or two, actually a second or two. That was incredibly informative. I appreciate that so much. Thank you, Chris. And I want to say thank you to everybody that attended today. Join us for our next session, which is going to be this Thursday, October 22nd, for What's New and What's Next, a State of the Industry panel. It's a panel discussion. We'll figure out our unmuting capabilities. A new access link is going to be sent to all attendees later today. So do not use the one you used for today. You'll get a new one. Take a moment. Jamie Adams will be sending out a survey regarding the presentations after Thursday. So check your emails out, and we certainly want to know your feedback. I'm going to do a quick FTI plug. Join us November 17th and 18th. We have a 2-day class coming up. It's Fascinating 101, and it's a live class, 2 days, and it's a great price for your entire company. And hold on a second. I'm sorry, another question came in. Do you think, no. Nope. Well, this presentation, sorry, everybody. This is being recorded, and Jamie will have this out to everybody within a couple of days. You'll have access to rewatch it. And I just want to say thank you again to everybody who joined. It was our first virtual joint conference. Thank you so much, Dr. Thornberg. I enjoyed that, and we really look forward to having you at our next conference. Hopefully it's in person.
Hopefully in person, yes. I hear we might be going back to San Antonio. Is that right?
We are. We're headed to San Antonio, and so we will be there. We'd love to see you there, and I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Be safe and have a great week.
Thank you. Take care.